in the state of Virginia, near the small town of Bayford. A thick mist rolled through the forests in the early morning hours of 2021. Spring had only just begun to unfold. The earth exhaled moisture into the air, and the trees, still hesitant, clutched the last of their winter bareness. Birds sang sparsely, their songs thin and cautious, not yet ready to claim the season. At the very edge of the woods lived Thomas, a retired forest ranger, now 63 years old. His house was small, tucked against the first rise of the hills, its windows blurred by the morning fog. Thomas lived simply, finding comfort in the steady rituals of the land that had shaped him. His only constant companion was Ramsey. Ramsey was a large dog, steady and silent, with a thick coat the color of lichen and old moss. Part Labrador, part Newfoundland, he carried the slow, deliberate grace of the woods themselves. His eyes were dark and serious, pools of patience, and he moved with the kind of caution that only years in the wild could teach. Every morning, Thomas and Ramsey walked the old trails, paths Thomas had once patrolled for work, now wandered simply for the peace they offered. The trails twisted through dense groves of pine and oak, climbed over worn hills, and dipped into valleys where the mist hung low like a second ground. That morning the mist was heavier than usual. It pressed close, swallowing sound, muffling footsteps, blurring the familiar shapes of trees into tall, ghostly figures. Even Ramsey slowed, his nose lifting into the thick air, muscles tense beneath his fur. Thomas adjusted the strap of his worn satchel and followed the dog's lead. He trusted Ramsey's instincts more than his own aging senses. In the fog, every rock and branch looked the same. Only Ramsey could weave through the landscape without doubt. They moved slowly, breathing in the cool dampness. It wasn't a morning for talking. It was a morning for listening, to the drip of water from branch to earth, to the faint creak of trees shifting, to the almost imperceptible rustle of life hidden in the undergrowth. The forest, shrouded in white, felt endless, like the world had folded in on itself and left only them walking through it. Thomas didn't question it. He simply kept pace with Ramsey, letting the dog's steady presence anchor him to the path he could no longer see. The fawn lay alone, a trembling shape almost indistinguishable from the damp earth. No sign of a mother nearby, no whisper of movement in the surrounding thickets. Only the slight shiver of a fragile body pressing itself closer to the ground, instinctively trying to disappear. Thomas paused, narrowing his eyes against the mist. He knew it wasn't uncommon for mother deer to leave their young hidden while they foraged. But usually, the fawns were tucked away in denser parts of the woods, not exposed on an open stretch like this. And here, so close to the back roads where cars sometimes thundered past, the risks were higher. The air itself seemed heavy with the faint, acrid scent of coyotes, invisible but close. Cautiously, Thomas stepped forward, his boots sinking softly into the mossy trail. But before he could get close, Ramsey moved. The big dog shifted smoothly between Thomas and the fawn, planting himself firmly in the middle. He did not growl, did not bare his teeth. He simply stood there, silent and immovable, a living shield. Thomas stopped. He understood. Ramsey lowered his massive head and gently licked the side of the fawn, a slow, deliberate motion, as if offering comfort rather than claiming possession. The fawn flinched but did not pull away. It quivered under the dog's careful touch, then stilled, its breathing slowing, though it remained curled tight against the ground. Hours stretched thinly between them. The mist slowly thinned, revealing faint streaks of pale blue sky. A reluctant sun began to tease the edges of the world back into focus. Thomas sank onto a fallen log a few feet away, watching without speaking. Ramsey settled beside the fawn, his body curving protectively around the tiny creature. His thick coat provided warmth where the spring air still held a biting chill. The fawn shifted once, tucking its muzzle against Ramsey's flank. and then, for the first time, seemed to breathe without fear. Thomas leaned forward slightly, his elbows resting on his knees. He knew better than to rush. Sometimes real help wasn't loud or immediate. Sometimes it wasn't about lifting or fixing or even speaking. Sometimes the greatest gift you could offer was to simply stay. To sit beside a trembling soul and say without words, "You are not alone." By midday, the forest began to stir. The skeletal creak of branches shifted with each rare gust of wind. Far off, crows exchanged ragged calls, their voices breaking the delicate hush. But along with the sounds of life came others, quieter and sharper. The faint rustle of leaves, the careful snap of a twig under deliberate weight. Thomas stiffened. He knew what it meant. Predators had caught the scent. Ramsey rose silently, his massive frame drawing itself into taut readiness. His fur bristled along the spine, standing up in thick ridges. He did not bark. He made no sound at all. Instead, he positioned himself directly over the fawn, his body a silent barrier between the vulnerable creature and the unseen dangers closing in. Thomas moved slowly, deliberately, careful not to make any sudden noise that might invite chaos. He reached into his worn canvas satchel and pulled out an old hiking stick, the tip of which was adorned with a battered brass bell. It was a trick from years back. The sharp, unexpected ring often startled scavengers long enough to buy time. He shook the stick once, and the bell's high metallic note cut through the mist like a blade. From the underbrush to the left, a shape flickered, low to the ground, narrow-shouldered, cautious. A coyote. Its eyes glinted for just a heartbeat before it melted backward into the shadows, unwilling to challenge the towering dog whose gaze alone promised a fight it would not win. Ramsey never flinched. He remained over the fawn, unmoving except for the slow rise and fall of his chest. His muscles vibrated with contained energy, a dam ready to break if necessary. But no attack came. The forest held its breath. The fawn did not stir beneath him. It seemed to understand, in the pure instinctive way that creatures sometimes do, that it was being protected, that for now, no harm could reach it. Thomas kept his eyes on the tree line, his hand still lightly tapping the bell. They were not safe yet. The woods were full of shadows, but sometimes, a shadow could stand guard too. Several more hours slipped by, heavy and slow, as the forest shifted from the dense mist of morning into the damp, restless breath of afternoon. Thomas managed to reach the local wildlife rehabilitation center on his old two-way radio, explaining the situation in short, urgent bursts. They promised to send help, but warned that the back roads were still slick and partially washed out from the recent rains. It would take time. In the meantime, Ramsey remained where he was, a steadfast figure beside the fragile life that had fallen into his care. After a while, he lay down again, curling his large body protectively around the fawn. His paws, broad and steady, formed a kind of barrier, a wall built not from aggression but from quiet determination. Every noise that rippled through the trees drew his attention, a snap of a twig, a gust of wind, the scurry of a distant animal. His ears twitched, his head lifted, but he did not leave his post. The weight of responsibility seemed stitched into his very being. The fawn, in its trembling innocence, sensed it too. Slowly, cautiously, it began to respond, nudging its tiny, damp nose into Ramsey's thick fur, seeking warmth, seeking comfort. Once or twice it dozed, its small head resting trustingly atop Ramsey's outstretched paw, its sides rising and falling in the tentative rhythm of sleep. Thomas stayed back, letting the bond unfold without interference. He knew what he was witnessing was rare, something beyond simple instinct. When the team from the center finally arrived, bumping their way down the muddy trail in a battered truck, they stepped out into a silence so complete it felt sacred. They froze for a moment, taking in the scene. The old man, weathered and still as a stone, the great moss-colored dog wrapped around a shivering scrap of life. They spoke in hushed tones, as if afraid to disturb the fragile bridge that had formed here, a bridge between fear and safety, between wild and tame, between worlds that rarely touched. Ramsey lifted his head, but did not move away. He stayed until the hands that reached for the fawn were sure and gentle, until the danger was passed not just by his judgment, but by something deeper. Only then did he step back, slow and reluctant, his dark eyes never leaving the fawn until it was safely cradled in careful arms. Ramsey did not want to let go. When the fawn was gently bundled into a thick, worn blanket and lifted onto a stretcher, he rose immediately, his paws pressing into the damp earth. He followed, close but silent, his head low, his body tense with something that wasn't fear but wasn't peace either. Thomas called his name softly, a thread of sound pulled through the heavy air. Ramsey paused but did not immediately return. His eyes remained fixed on the small bundle until the back of the wildlife center's truck closed with a muted thud, and the fawn disappeared from view. Only then, reluctantly, Ramsey turned. The walk back home was slow. Ramsey kept close to Thomas's side, not dragging from exhaustion, but moving with the weight of someone who had just handed over something he could never retrieve. His movements were thoughtful, measured, as if every step was a quiet acknowledgement of something he could not name. Thomas reached out and rested a calloused hand on the dog's broad back, feeling the steady warmth beneath the damp fur. No words were needed. They walked together along the mist-laden path, leaving the clearing, the fallen branches, and the echoes of small, defiant life behind them. When they reached the cabin, Ramsey did not immediately retreat to his usual corner by the hearth. Instead, he settled himself by the front door, his head resting against the threshold, his body facing outward. Through the open window, the woods whispered and shifted in the cooling air. The world carried on, unaware of the small piece of it that had just been mended and released. All evening, Ramsey lay there, occasionally lifting his head at the slightest sound outside, the crackle of a branch, the flutter of an owl's wings, the distant trickle of water over stones. But no fawn's cry came, no soft hoofsteps returned. Night fell. The cabin sank into its familiar hush, the fire dying into embers. Thomas sat in his old armchair, the light from a single lamp pooling around him, watching the shape of the dog by the door. Ramsey did not whine. He did not pace. He simply kept vigil, his stillness saying what he could not. He had given everything he could. He had stayed as long as he was needed. Now, in the quiet, he stayed still, not because he was waiting for someone to return, but because part of him remained there, out in the woods, forever curled around a fragile heartbeat he had once kept safe. A month later, a letter arrived at the cabin, carried in the worn satchel of the town's only mailman. Thomas opened it carefully, as if the weight of the paper might crumble in his hands. It was from the Wildlife Rehabilitation Center. The words were simple but full of quiet pride. The fawn had survived. They had named him Spark, not because of his smallness, but because of the fire he had lit in everyone who had helped save him. When he grew stronger, they wrote, he would be released back into the wild, where he belonged. Thomas read the letter aloud, sitting by the window with the spring sun casting long stripes of gold across the floor. Ramsey lay stretched at his feet, his head resting on his paws. He did not understand the words, but he listened all the same. He felt the slow, steady hum of something finished but not forgotten. When the days grew warmer and the forest began to shift from muddy brown to vibrant green, Thomas and Ramsey took the old trail again. The path had dried, the branches above knitted themselves into a pale green canopy, and the bird's song was stronger now, more certain. At the place where the fawn had once lain trembling against the cold earth, Ramsey slowed. His steps became careful, almost reverent. He sniffed the ground, lifted his head to the breeze, and turned his gaze toward the dense line of trees beyond. Then he sat down. He did not whine or search. He simply sat, breathing in the living, pulsing scent of the woods as if to say, this was enough. This was right. Thomas stood quietly behind him, feeling the press of memory against the fresh air, feeling how time could bend but never erase certain moments. Because sometimes, salvation was not a matter of fighting or fleeing. Sometimes, it was about staying, about warmth offered without expectation, about presence that asked for nothing in return. And sometimes, the quiet acts left deeper footprints than all the noise in the world. Ramsey stayed there for a long while, ears flicking gently at the whisper of the forest, his body relaxed, his spirit at ease. Some marks you leave are not seen by the eye, but carried forever in the heart.